It's recording. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm Theo Witsell, ecologist and chief of research for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission.
And I'm Dustin Lynch, aquatic ecologist for the Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission.
We're going to tag team a presentation to tell you about conservation of groundwater stream biodiversity at 2 sites in Northwest Arkansas. Northwest Arkansas, and in particular 2 counties, Benton and Washington, the 2 northwesternmost counties of the state, is one of the fastest developing regions in the country. For the last 10 years, they've been adding on average about 1,000 people per month to this region. It's in the Ozark Highlands, and in particular, we're going to tell you about 2 ecoregions in that area, the Springfield Plateau and the dissected Springfield Plateau. Next slide. The Springfield Plateau is sort of the more gentle terrain in Northwest Arkansas. It's a flat to gently rolling karst plain. And the dissected Springfield Plateau is a lower elevation, more dissected portion of that same land surface. Historically, this area was largely grassland. There was more than 70,000 acres of treeless tallgrass prairie mapped in the original land survey in this area, but much of the balance of that Springfield Plateau was open savanna and open woodland. So it was very sparsely wooded. And also, as the name implies, the Springfield Plateau was rich in groundwater. There's lots of springs, seeps, historically open fens. And in both the grasslands and these groundwater features are all critically imperiled in the region and have all declined. And the remnants that we have of those are rich in rare biodiversity, and they're a top conservation priority. Next slide.
This part of the state is actually home to 2 of the rarest fish species in Arkansas, the Arkansas darter, Ethiostoma cragini, and the least darter, Ethiostoma microperca. And what's somewhat unusual about these fish is that they are heavily associated with these open woodland, savanna, and prairie habitats. There are over 200 darter species in North America, mostly in the southeast part of the country. We don't typically think of them as prairie associated, but that is the case with these 2 fish. These are species that in Arkansas are restricted to an area of about 140 square miles, and every known occurrence is either in or near this rapidly urbanizing area. The Arkansas darter, Ethiostoma cragini, is not actually named for the state of Arkansas. That's kind of a misnomer. It was named for the Arkansas River Basin. And if you look at this range map, it's really a Great Plains species, with most of its range being in Kansas and eastern Colorado. There's only a small area of the country where it overlaps with the next species, the least darter, Ethiostoma microperca, with that being kind of the area around northwest Arkansas and northeast Oklahoma. The least darter, as the name implies, is a very small fish. It's actually one of the smallest species in North America, and it is the smallest native fish in Arkansas. And the 2 of them really require aquatic vegetation that's facilitated by this open canopy stream habitat. This map, again, shows this area of mapped tallgrass prairie that historically was in northwest Arkansas, along with that white portion on the map, which is savanna and open woodland. So you can see that plotted against all known occurrences of Arkansas and least darter in the state, and that there's a pretty tight correlation. That is where these species were historically. And in fact, if you look at some of those prairies, they're pretty tightly correlated with some of these populations of darters. So we're going to focus on one in particular.
This is a historical prairie area that we call Clabber Creek Prairie, so named for the creek that flows through the middle of it. And historically, it was wet prairie. You can see pimple mounds in this photograph. That's a characteristic of those seasonally wet hardpan clay prairies that we have. And the yellow dots are known occurrences of Arkansas darter. This area, as I mentioned, is developing very rapidly. This is on the north side of the city of Fayetteville. And this is what it looked like in 1995. It was still rural, mostly open, lots of hayfields and pastures. And in just 25 years, we've seen a massive changes in this area. Next slide. This is at 25 years later. Much of it's lost to dense urban development. And then the balance that's no longer still being managed as hayfields or pastures has grown up in woody vegetation. It's no longer open grassland. Next slide. Unfortunately, there is a natural preserve in that area, the Wilson Springs Preserve, which is managed by the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust. And again, you can see the occurrences of Arkansas darter within the preserve. Next slide. But even this preserve has changed dramatically in the last 25 years. Before it was actually protected, it was largely open. There was some savanna in the lower right of the photo of the preserve in the photo, and then the balance was mostly open pasture or hayfield. And then, of course, there was some wooded areas. The blue area is the spring run, which emerges from under the interstate exchange and runs into Clabber Creek. Next slide. Just 15 years later, though, things had changed dramatically. The site had been protected, and that meant no longer was being managed. And in that time, it grew up almost entirely in woody vegetation, from shrubs to small trees, choking out mostly the whole place. Next slide. Fortunately, the Land Trust began a process of habitat restoration and management, where they went in and thinned the canopy, especially along the spring runs at first, and later spread throughout most of the area, and also removed a lot of the woody shrub layer that was very dense, including a number of non-native species of trees and shrubs. Next slide. And that management on the ground made a huge difference. Here you can see the spring run is cleared of woody vegetation. You can see some stumps in the background from larger trees that were removed. And you can see this dense grassland-derived herbaceous layer of sedges, rushes, grasses, and forbs. And that little spring run there is the spring run where the Arkansas darter is found. It's very small, you could step across it. This is the first site in the state where Arkansas darter was found, and the first one protected for that species. Next slide. The management is really night and day on the ground in there. This is on the left, unmanaged, and on the right of the spring run, managed, removed the shrub layer. You can see some old open grown oaks, remnants of the old savanna in the background. Next slide. The Land Trust also contracted out with a forestry mulcher or timber grinder to come in and chew up a lot of the smaller woody vegetation. And over time, that has responded dramatically with, as you saw in the couple slides previous. Next. There's also some rare terrestrial wetland habitats that are spring fed on the site, like our best example of a prairie fen habitat left in Northwest Arkansas is in this preserve. And there's a couple of shots from that. You can see some of the plants. Next slide. Many of the species in the fen there, plants are rare or uncommon. Some are rare, tracked by the Heritage Program. Others are just rare in the region, maybe more common in the Gulf Coastal Plain or some other ecoregion. Next slide.
Another extremely important site in this area is Healing Springs Natural Area. This is an 84.5 acre preserve, and this is one of the newest natural areas in the Heritage Commission's system of natural areas. This is a really important site because it's one of the best remaining sites for both the Arkansas and least darter. So there are a few sites that have just Arkansas, a few that have just least, and only a couple that have both species, and this is the best for both of them. As you can see, it's got this characteristic, really open canopy habitat with lots of aquatic vegetation. And this place has a really interesting history when it comes to land use. So at one point, this was an exotic animal farm. There were things like European red deer there, and then later it became a llama farm. And then eventually it was heavily kind of overgrazed by cattle. So that history of grazing has heavily impacted the terrestrial communities there and the plants in particular. But ironically, it probably facilitated keeping this canopy open, which has allowed these two rare darters to persist. This is an aerial photo of the property. The history of this place in terms of acquisition is the Heritage Commission got this with the help of the Arkansas Department of Transportation, who actually needed it as a stream mitigation site for a project they were doing in that same watershed. The pasture areas are the process of being restored now to more of a historic tallgrass prairie community that would have been there. This collage just shows different parts of the natural area and what some of the different habitats there look like. Again, open canopy, lots of aquatic vegetation, and the two darter species don't fully inhabit every part of both spring runs that are at this natural area, but even the parts that don't have those two species, again, the Arkansas and least darter pictured here, contain many other interesting and rare aquatic species. So the natural area is actually home to several other tracked fish species, and these are all fairly rare regional endemics, things like the sunburst darter, the newly described plateau darter, and this large minnow, the red spot chub, which are all found in the natural area. It's also got some really interesting rare and tracked crayfish species. So there are two fairly narrow range endemic stream dwelling crayfish, the midget crayfish and meek short pointed crayfish that are both confined to the Illinois River watershed. And then this really interesting primary burrowing species, the Osage burrowing crayfish, which is heavily associated with historical wet prairies and savanna habitats that's also found on the property. It's also found in the recharge zone of a spring nearby that has a population of Ozark cavefish. This is a federally listed species that's obviously a cave obligate and heavily impacted by rapid urban development in the area.
The terrestrial natural communities at this site are heavily altered. It's probably the least intact flora of any natural area in the system. However, we're looking at that as a real opportunity for restoration, and there's some wonderful old open grown remnant savanna trees there that really are a testament to what the character of this landscape would have been like historically. Old bur oaks and chinkapin oaks, which are characteristic species of these calcareous savannas in the region. Next slide. And this is, these projects are all very much collaborative efforts with a lot of different conservation partners active in Northwest Arkansas. Monitoring of and locating these rare species, aquatic species, has been ongoing with the Game and Fish Commission. And there's all these agencies and nonprofits that have worked together to do conservation on these sites. Thank you.